Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gabriel Calatrava.
Keeping up with the momentum, I'll turn things over to the next series of speakers, who will help us explore the question, has New York become a place where it's too expensive to take a risk? Diverse economies depend upon entrepreneurs, innovators, and artists, but New York City and other global cities are facing the reality that these key groups are often the first to be crowded out by rising rent and cost of living. In the next section, we'll hear from a series of leaders who are working in some of New York's most rapidly changing neighborhoods to preserve their local innovation economy. To begin, I'd like to welcome Greg Lindsay, Senior Fellow at the New Cities Foundation and one of the country's foremost thinkers on the future of urban settlement. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. In her 1969 book, The Economy of Cities, Jane Jacobs talked about the phenomenon of new work, the notion that workers at firms with new ideas, with new ways of recombining various aspects of production would break away, would find affordable spaces, would find ways to recombine and produce new firms, the economic complexity and diversity that led to a replenished city. And of course, this is the idea that underlies her famous maxim that, of course, that new ideas require old buildings. But what happens in a city where there are no longer any old buildings? And by this, of course, I mean not just in terms of price, but also spaces that are affordable, that are open to conversion, places where people can basically try out ideas and not just fail, of course, without consequence, but also succeed and expand from there. Because the problem we've had with New York, the revitalization of New York in the last couple decades, is that we've increasingly pushed out these makers, these entrepreneurs. We've pushed them into enclaves like the Garment District and Industry City, which are, of course, also now under threat for luxury development. We still have a few affordable enclaves like the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but even these places are becoming gentrified in their own way. So for example, 10 years ago, we had the advent of coworking. This was the phenomenon, of course, where strangers who work side by side in spaces who are not necessarily colleagues. This started in places where people could sit together with a Wi-Fi signal and a coffee pot in a marginal building. In places like Canal Street, Newark City was one of the first. Today, of course, the face of coworking in New York City is WeWork, which has a $10 billion valuation, which works with families like the Rudins to basically create new spaces, and WeWork is building a 675,000 square foot new build in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. This is nothing against WeWork, of course, but what started as a place where people could basically work very inexpensively and find new people has become a large-scale phenomenon with premium rents and, of course, has been devoted to the whole notion of technology. These are essentially seen as tech spaces. So how do we create a new generation of affordable spaces? How do we create old buildings? We've already seen some blunt instruments here being deployed. I want to take this moment to remind you that someone jumped the gun on voting on the question about should we have commercial rent control. I'd like you to continue voting on this question until the end of our panel, and we'll discuss that. But what new institutions do we need? What new structures do we need? Do we need things like a real estate cooperative? We have people in New York City who are now thinking about bringing back the notion of the guild, of actually bringing back membership co-ops and sort of ways that people can combine ideas and practices there. Our next panel is really going to get into this notion about how do we create this sort of new generation of spaces that go beyond co-working, beyond incubators, beyond accelerators, and beyond the notion that these are places that should be tech hubs. So I want to take now this moment to basically invite out our panelists, if they are ready. We have Jonathan, I'll let you read your bios. We have Jonathan Ortman, Bryan Boyer, Hope Knight, and Eric Ho. And we're going to get into some of these questions about this. How do we basically at finer grained scale start to create the kind of spaces and institutions that we need to protect entrepreneurship and artists in the city? So thank you all for joining me. I want to use this opportunity to get into this. I mean, we've already seen, for example, the notion of a co-op being suggested, which has this sort of, and also rent control, which both are essentially about preservation. We need to freeze parts of the city in time. How do we create spaces that can embrace the churn? How do we create institutions that can embrace the churn, that will accept the fact that, that even if we try to arrest the forces that are turning all of these industrial buildings into luxury real estate, how do we continue to carve out spaces where people can try out these ideas? Anyone? Eric, Hope.
Great. I started an organization called Miles. We basically do short-term uses at storefronts. So what we do is really kind of a shared economy model where people either share space or share time in a space. We work with landlords, long-term leaseholders to basically, hey, you have an underused space. Let's figure out a way to work with emerging either startups, businesses, community groups, or artists to showcase their work. So I think there's a way where we can create something together, and with this kind of shared economy kind of model, it's really interesting to see partnerships forming with these sort of very organic way of using spaces, and that's what we do. Yeah.
Hope you're working with real estate directly in Jamaica and East Harlem as well. So what kind of institutions are you creating there?
So with the Greater Jamaica Development Corporation, most of our focus is around real estate. And we run a market where we have 15 small entrepreneurs who sell their products in that market. And I think, nonprofits with ownership is a way to create a structure which supports small entrepreneurs.
Great. Jonathan, some of your work, you really focus on sort of some of the shortcomings of the models that exist now. Everyone thinks about, that when we have co-working and incubators and accelerators, that it's A, all about tech, and B, once you have these, that's all you need and you're set. I know some of your work with Kaufman, you've actually looked into the shortcomings of the current generation of institutions. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, and I think as a preface to that, I think you have to remember that New York City is somewhat unique in this circumstance to most places in the world that are trying to develop vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystems, in that real estate is really a major barrier. Whereas, in many of the, we call it the rise of the rest, and in many other cities around the world, we operate in 160 countries, real estate is actually the big problem in a different way, in that people concentrate too much on real estate and not enough on what's actually the essence of what goes into creating a formula for a potential new venture. So I think the first thing is to recognize that that's true. I think the second thing is to recognize that we shouldn't be frightened to move away from what are the core commercial components that we need to see in creating successful entrepreneurs. So for example, when we've looked at cities that have been successful, we see things like you've got to make sure that you maintain connectivity. So I think we heard about that just a few minutes ago. Obviously, New York doesn't face a challenge like some other cities, but clearly connectivity is where everything occurs in terms of networks. Secondly, I think you've got to make sure that you're maintaining density. New York really doesn't have a problem with density, but you could have a problem if you're not careful with that. And I think, but at the end of the day, the most important criteria really comes with this notion of fluidity. You've got to be able to allow people to be able to move between cultures in order to be able to find the best ideas at those intersections of disciplines and cultures. So I guess the one thing I would say is let's not lose sight of some of the most important things, because the value systems in most millennials now that are working out of these spaces, you don't really see people getting into this purely for profit anymore. I mean, the majority, I understand that we're not far from Wall Street, and we always make fun, those of us who don't live in New York City, about Wall Street. They're really the guys that don't give us entrepreneurs a really good face sometimes. But the reality is the average entrepreneur is not in for this. They're figuring out what's a better way of doing things. They're curious, they're creative, as we all know. And so we need to continue to create the environment that allows them to do that along the way. So.
Yeah. Just to add to that, from an institutional perspective, one of the things that I think we can do is actually learn a little bit from Silicon Valley, not in terms of what they invest in, but how they invest in it. So if you're a VC in the Valley, you think about your portfolio. That has talent, that has IP, that has, sure, some tables and computers and things. When one of your investments dissolves, you can use those disaggregated components. You can take a bit of the talent from here and put it in another portfolio company. You can use the IP here that's going to go fallow and give it to another company. How do we think about the same kind of approach of reusing the assets that we have inside a socially motivated community? Because frankly, right now, I think a lot of the investments, the money that we pour into the nonprofit and kind of affiliated approaches is relatively unsophisticated compared to what we see elsewhere.
Well, that raises a question. I mean, in addition, I think it's not quoted in your bio, but you're also a partner in Makeshift Society, which is a co-working space. So I'm curious, what have you learned from the current generation of co-working, and what kind of structure should that take then? I mean, do we need the city to run a sort of portfolio of people in spaces and that? Should that be a nonprofit? Should that be a for-profit co-working? And then you end up like WeWork with 23,000 members. How do you balance between the sort of social aspects of that and just being a for-profit co-working chain?
So co-working, whenever you hear the word co-working, you should think of real estate, right? Mm-hmm. Co-working has basically become real estate at the size of a desk instead of the size of a room or a building. And that's pretty much my view of the future of commercial real estate. I think on the spectrum of what we have called co-working in the past, there are some firms which are very focused on just delivering a cheap place to work, and others which are focused more on building a community. And that's kind of what Makeshift falls into. But Greg's being very kind and not mentioning the fact that tomorrow is the last day of Makeshift Society Brooklyn. So I can tell you that few people want to pay the convener. Few people want to pay the person that builds the community. In the past, we had all sorts of community organizations, some religious, some not, that played that role. I think we're at perhaps the beginning of a crisis period where we've made it too expensive for traditional community operators and organizers to really operate at scale, but we haven't found a new replacement in the secular realm for who provides that community glue role or function.
I kind of want to follow up on that because we're actually also working on a very similar project in the town called Prime Produce, and it's New Yorker wrote a great article on it. It's called A Modern Day Guild, and it's pretty much the same sort of ideology, I think. But it's a three stories building where there's a rooftop farm, there's a co-working space, there's a sort of retail and event component, there's artist studio. So it's a very sort of vibrant community that's very diverse, very much, I guess, like Makeshift. And I think,
special slippers.
And special slippers. I think there are different ways to do it. I feel like it's a very special circumstances that project came about, and I think there are ways of funding that could be sort of explored in a very, a unique way, and I think that's something that is, I think it could be continued, like what Makeshift is doing, and I feel like, we need it. Yeah.
So,
Jonathan first.
I was just going to say, I mean, to some degree, the answer to your question was, how do we decide which of these, models to go for? And one of the things I think entrepreneurs teach us is that it's messy, okay? And you can't predict the outcomes. So you have to go into it accepting the fact that we're going to be building the airplane in the air all the time. Who's sitting in the mayor's office? Who's not sitting in the mayor's office? What's happening in these communities? What other decisions got made in some major commercial real estate development? What else is happening in that neighborhood? So I think you've got to allow that to occur. But I think you've got to be very disciplined in your thinking, to come back to your earlier point. And at the Kauffman Foundation, we try to make it quite clear that you've got to be quite clear. Is this an incubator? Is it an accelerator? Is it a shared workspace? Is this an executive office suite? Is this a community building, share our produce feel? The nice thing is you can mix all these together and you can have a lot of fun in different communities, bringing up the different vibrancy and the characteristics of communities. But I think you have to be clear about what you're trying to accomplish. So for example, our research shows that as far as incubators are concerned, we actually can't find any evidence to show that incubators actually make a big deal of difference if your mission is to come up with a larger number of new firms formed. Heresy, okay? But what do you mean by an incubator? Well, we're sort of looking at, generally speaking, people that go get a piece of space and they try to rent out all the pieces. Generally speaking, incubators have done an awful job of what you've done a great job here in New York City with, which is building community around a space, on the other end. So we tend to use the word hub. It's kind of generic, it might have office space, it might have an accelerator in it, it might have a fund, it might not. Its unique characteristic may be that it's bringing together two different disciplines in a field. But I do think that's something that, to somewhat answer your question, what method do we go? We've got to work out where is the specific gap we're trying to fill, and what is the opportunity we're trying to capitalize on in terms of, the cultural assets that you've got to work with.
Yeah. Bryan, do you still have a point you want to make?
Yeah, because I think it's relevant to what both of these gentlemen were saying, which is, from my view, too much of the really great, powerful things that happen here in this realm of sort of shared spaces happen because there was one kind of genius at the right moment, or more often the case, there's one person who's willing to foot the bill, right? And so, I agree with Eric, the work that you guys are doing is going to be awesome, but you just happen to find just the right landlord. And that similar story plays out in other parts of New York City as well. And I think that's not the city that we want. We don't want a city that relies on the beneficial rich uncle, metaphorically speaking. We want a city where anybody is empowered to take a relatively safe risk to put themselves out there and accomplish something similar.
Agree. I'm actually working on a piece right now that's being published in a few months in the New Republic, looking at a program that's very similar to one of Eric's, called Renew Newcastle. It started out of Australia there, where in that case they actually had Newcastle is really sort of the Cleveland of Australia, very depressed inner core, where an arts festival organizer went in and worked with the local landlords, and particularly one of Australia's largest developers, which had quietly bought up much of the core, to basically, instead of have entrepreneurs and artists sign leases, they would sign rolling 30-day access permits. So it was a way to very flexibly use the space and actually lowered the bar of entry, so basically people could come and try out ideas and spawn all these new businesses. And two of the things I take away from that, or three of the things I take away, is one is it required a single person to actually have the initiative to do it, so it had that as a bottleneck. Two is that, in the end, it could still be very quickly gentrified when it's finished. And three, it's required a lot of public subsidy, both from the city and various Australia's arts organizers. And that's one of the things I think that ties into this as well, is that, even when it's not just a rich uncle in there, you still need a lot of public subsidy to basically sort of isolate the space and preserve it. And I know this is one of the things that Hope's looked at.
No, absolutely. I want to talk about commercial kitchen space. I've worked in underserved communities, and there's an entrepreneurial impulse for underserved people to look at food as a business. And so commercial kitchen spaces have been very successful in some of the communities I've worked in. Hotbread Kitchen is a venture nonprofit that ventured with the New York City Economic Development Corporation to repurpose the old La Marqueta under the Park Avenue L to provide kitchen space to small entrepreneurs. And that project needed a lot of subsidy to get done, and I see that over and over in underserved communities.
Yeah, well, I would suspect too, Eric, we were discussing how to actually structure this. What would it take to basically take Made in Lower East Side and make it made in New York, and that we already have Made in New York, but another Made in New York
Right.
that's really essentially a citywide program that any vacant space could be basically enrolled in that and used on a short-term basis. What components would we need for that?
So we think about this a lot. So I think kind of going back to all these people's panelists' point is, there's a gap. There's the traditional small business, right? How do you help a traditional small business grow? There's a typical tech, $100 million business. You have to be that. In between, is kind of Wild West. How do you actually grow? And then below that category, there's also the side hustlers, the Etsy sellers. Those are people that have full-time job that has a passion towards something. So how do you? There's a whole sort of ecosystem of small businesses, lining up to be the small business, and then going up to the tech. So how do you sort of structure sort of this whole wide range of ecosystem? I feel like there's a huge component of education and cultivation that it definitely needs subsidy. It probably needs, some, part of the system is privately funded. Some part of it could be, a shared resource way of sort of tackling the problem. Maybe 3 or 4 merchants sharing the same space. I've seen that happening in Jersey City. We know a merchant that does that pretty successfully. So I think there's a multi there's many solutions to the same problem, but I think we have to tackle it in so many different levels, and also where the businesses are is also important, because one business that is an Etsy seller to an emerging sort of tech company, it's a very different thing that we're talking about, and who are we actually really trying to help is also the question.
One of the things also worth looking at, which tags onto this, so I just came back from Toronto, and we had 2 meetings with 2 companies, and these 2 companies said, we understand for our future, one of them was BlackBerry, that we have to engage with this entrepreneurial class, this creative class of innovators, but we don't really know how to do it. We know that we want to outsource our R&D now away from a corporate culture into for example, throw it out to startups, let them try their hand at it. We know we like the idea of investing in startups and acquiring startups, but we really don't know how to do it. And one of the answers that we came up for them that they're going to do in Toronto in 2 places is we said, well, we got a lot of entrepreneurs that frankly don't have the right place to be able to go. And by the way, they don't need a lot. Most of the time they want a coffee machine, they want great connectivity, and they want a place they can sit. Yep. And a lot of the ones that I invest in and find actually sitting on the floor. But the point is, it's like, I told them, look at your real estate assets, because you're not going to give them up. you can loan them. And I think, you're talking about the city, and I understand this is the point you're making, but I think it's this notion of bringing the shared economy concept into the corporate boardroom to say, by the way, guys, this is not just a way that you can give back to the city. It's not the way you can just be part of this culture. This is actually a way that you can absorb it. This is a way that you can actually bring that innovative sort of creative culture into your company.
Absolutely. I would say I was in Amsterdam last week, actually meeting with Seats to Meet, which is a co-working chain there, where they're actually now working with corporations to basically take their lobby spaces and cafeterias and try to make it that permeability. But I want to ask a question here. We're getting a little low on time, but I think it's really interesting. So far we've talked about creating new entities, new structures. But what I find interesting about New York is there's almost two parallel narratives right now about manufacturing in the city. There's the narrative of decline, that the garment district is forever shrinking and that it's imperiled and that basically it's full of classic garmentos who are nearing retirement age. And then you have this other parallel story of the maker movement, which is of course growing all the time. And my question is, are there ways to put these two stories together here? I mean, the garment district and its manufacturing base represents a tremendous platform of expertise that all these millennial kids who want to start making, shoes and clothing and ironworking could basically tap into that. But there's no way to put these two pieces together yet. And I'm curious whether this is something we should also be exploring, or ways we can get, whether the city or a nonprofit or somebody, where we can try to put these two things together.
Yeah, we think about that all the time because we match make people with spaces, basically, is what we do. And people and spaces is always something that we think about. And the traditional businesses are people that actually runs these spaces, like a traditional, in a traditional neighborhood, maybe a small shop in there. And we always work with these side hustlers that are the new makers that are making their jewelries in their shop. There's definitely a way to sort of bring them together in a way. There's space, there's people, there's audience that are new. There's a traditional structure that exists. It's an untapped resource. So how do we connect them? We need someone to actually be that gel to connect those things. And I feel like we need more of those in the city. Yeah.
Very quick comment on that. We should remember that innovation is actually where you bring together somebody like the garment industry with unique knowledge of that industry, with historical perspective of what mistakes they made along the way, with some young person with an extraordinary disruptive idea. And disruptive ideas don't become innovation until you match them with someone with unique knowledge of that industry. And the motivation of who should bring it together should be the garment industry. If they want to survive, they need that. They need those fresh ideas. That's actually their only potential course in the future. So I would say if they're not driving that, they should be.
No. Well, let's go back to that. I mean, any ideas from Bryan or Hope on how we would structure that? I mean, should we have a nonprofit that sort of exists to matchmake them? Should that be a for-profit, makeshift garment district kind of thing, or another development corporation? Any ideas on how we should go about trying to put those two together and then protect it so it can scale or create that platform? God, I'm just spouting buzzwords now. Yes, platforms and everything else.
It should be an existing organization that maybe takes on the role because it has the ability to have the members come together already.
Yeah.
I'm going to maybe take a counter perspective, which is, for me, the engine that does that best is a thriving city. So if we have high-quality public spaces, if we have efficient and effective public transit, if we have affordable housing that people can live close together, those communities of people who need to find each other will find each other. And they will experiment, and if it doesn't work, they will dissolve and find another way to experiment together with a different group of people. So as much as I think there are very important roles for intermediaries, for me the fundamental is how do we make the city good for everyone, because entrepreneurs are part of that everyone, and that's the starting point.
Great. Well, on that note, we're going to come back to our earlier poll question. Let's see the final results on that now that more than one person has voted. So I don't know if we can get that up on screen. How many people in this room actually do think we need commercial rent control? If it's okay, 60%. I was hoping this might be 100% again. 60%. Oh, the voting continues. We're never going to get back to 100%, but it is interesting to see we have a filibuster-proof majority here that claims that we should have it.
Look at that.
We're up to. There we go. Continue.
You didn't know you were so powerful, did you?
I was to say, I had no idea what I was calling for here. Well, this is great. Well, obviously, we can see in this room that we still have there's a strong desire. I love real time. Strong desire for this kind of support and new kinds of approaches. So with that, can I have a hand for our panel? And thank you so much. Thank you all so much. And I think now we have a performance, so let's go.